And also, I think the practical one, is this the right way to apply Stoicism, or is Stoicism helping me see what's most important in this situation? So I think we're trying to balance those things, and self-help risks a kind of shallowness, lack of conviction, a failure to fundamentally transform. Welcome to Stoic Conversations. In this podcast, Michael Tremblay and I discuss the theory and practice of Stoicism. Each week, we'll share 2 conversations, one between the 2 of us, and another will be an in-depth conversation with an expert. Welcome to Stoic Conversations. My name is Caleb Ontiveros.
And I'm Michael Tremblay.
And today we're going to be talking about modern self-help and how it's different from philosophy, and then looking at some of the advantages or disadvantages of self-help and its application to life.
Yeah, I wanted to talk about this because I think self-help is such an interesting genre and has a really interesting place in, contemporary society. Ancient philosophy is not mainstream anymore. This is obviously, if you're listening to this podcast, you're interested in ancient philosophy and philosophy more general. But I would not say Stoicism is as popular or as well known as it would have been in Rome or ancient Greece. And back then, ancient philosophy, it had this important cultural niche, which it was about deep introspection into how to live and to how to be a better person. It's, as we always talk about here, it was both about education, so theory, and transformation, so that practice, actually changing what you do and what you think. Today, I think self-help fills that niche. Self-help is what the non-philosopher, someone who is not turning to either philosophy or religion, what that person does, what somebody looking for self-development and self-improvement turns to. And these are the authors, the thinkers, the writers who are sharing ideas about how to live, actually taking a stance. And if you want your life to be better, do this instead of this. So it's almost this replacement of ancient philosophy, or replacing that function. Another thing, though, is that self-help has a bad reputation in some circles. Like, it's something that I know gets made fun of. I always thought it was a bit strange to make fun of. I'm not the kind of person who would criticize somebody who is pursuing self-improvement. I always thought that was very admirable, but at the same time, there's possibly something to those criticisms, and that there might be something that self-help gets wrong, or something that self-help in its worst forms, I guess, distorts about self-improvement, or maybe focuses on the wrong things. So I thought this would be an interesting topic for us to explore: self-help versus philosophy, how they're different, what one does better than the other. And so today, talk a bit about that, the difference between self-help and philosophy, then what's bad about self-help, or maybe some of its criticisms or the things I think it does worse than philosophy, and then what's good about self-help, or some of the things it does better than philosophy.
I think it's some interesting questions, important questions. And of course, I think it's connected to Stoicism because a lot of people see Stoicism as self-help. Sometimes it's explicitly marketed as a way to improve yourself, whereas others, I think, really push against that characterization and want to say, look, Stoicism, of course, it has some of those practical aspects that self-help does, but it's a philosophy of life. It's more than self-help. And in the best sense, it's closer to a full worldview that guides one's actions in a really fundamental way. And so, of course, I think there's that tension, and that tension gives rise to some of these questions.
Mm-hmm. Well, let's jump into that. So I want to talk about what is self-help and how is it different than philosophy, and that will draw some of that out, because I think you're exactly right. Some people are happy to think of Stoicism as self-help, and some people are more resistant to it. And so why is that the case? So I, like any good philosopher, I just sat down and thought about it. I came up with these kind of 2 definitions for self-help. So the first one is a broad definition, and one's a narrow definition. In the broad definition, I think that self-help is any kind of book or medium that's aimed at self-directed improvement of oneself, focusing primarily on psychological development. So, the Stoics might say something like character or virtue. Today, we might say something like, your psychology, your mental health, your work ethic, your attitude, your behavior. So focused on that psychological development. It's self-directed. You're not having an instructor or a coach. You're reading this material, engaging with it on your own pace, and developing yourself. So that's the broad definition. But by that definition, Stoicism is self-help. Marcus's Meditations was self-help when he was writing it, and it's self-help when we read it. Most philosophies, the ethical components of them, as long as they're aimed at actual transformation, actual development, those would be self-help. That's the broad definition. I think that's the most inclusive one. But then I think there's this narrow definition, which would be more relevant for our purposes, and that's a contemporary genre of media aimed at self-improvement. I typically think of this as starting with Carnegie's, How to Win Friends and Influence People. That's from 1936. And as a contemporary genre, I think of other famous ones like Atomic Habits, The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck by Mark Manson, 12 Rules for Life by Jordan Peterson, Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, The Secret by Rhonda Byrne, The Gifts of Imperfection by Brené Brown. So we think of this contemporary genre of self improvement, and it's different from philosophy, and it's different from religion because it's not grounded in this historical context. It's a contemporary movement. It's a contemporary way of looking at self development, which is, I would say, also these kinds of narrower scopes, narrower topics than philosophy or religion tackle. I would say that what a philosophy is typically embedded in a larger system, even an ethical philosophy. So you look at something like Stoicism, it talks about ethics, but it also talks about logic, metaphysics, physics, the nature of the world, political philosophy. It's a broader system about understanding the entirety of the world, of which ethics is a piece. I would say religion does the same thing. And then self-help carves out a piece of self-improvement. And I would say focuses exclusively on that. So something like Atomic Habits is a good example. We're to focus just on habit development. And that's a relatively modern phenomenon. I'm sure examples like that existed in ancient time as well, but it's a modern phenomenon in terms of its popularity.
Yeah, I think that's a fine definition. I suppose that no, we're going to be talking using the narrow definition,
Mm-hmm.
talking about contemporary self help, and what distinguishes that from something like Stoicism, Buddhism, is those philosophies are about improving the whole self, or about how you ought to live in a fundamental sense. Whereas many of these self-help books, they take, as you said, a narrower slice on a given area of life, whether it's relationships, habits, feeling better, becoming richer, what have you, and say, this is how you can help yourself achieve those goals. And they're more liberal in the sense that I think they're less opinionated when it comes to someone's worldview. You could read Atomic Habits and be a Christian, a Confucian, an atheist, what have you. And you don't need to sign on to any deeper picture about the nature of yourself or the world. Which, of course, if you're interacting with Stoic works as well, you don't necessarily need to do that. There's plenty of practical wisdom, but there's not that any sense of a framework or any sense of a life philosophy behind some of these self-help type works. Though perhaps there are some exceptions. Some Jordan Peterson's work is maybe a little bit in between, where he does have some philosophical views rooted in young Christianity and so on, that in 12 Rules for Life are not at the forefront, but don't exactly fit into the definition as we stated. It's almost like a gateway drug, if you will, to his philosophy. It comes in without those presuppositions, but if you dive more into his thinking, then slide into his harder stuff. And perhaps some modern Stoic works take the same strategy, making things broadly appealing and then explaining more and more, detailing more and more about the practice. And you find out suddenly, I've become a Stoic through all this interaction with Stoic thought.
Yeah, that's a good point. I think that is like the broad, like the difference between self-help and philosophy at its core is that kind of systematic commitment, which is to say, if you're doing philosophy, you're committing to a broader system. These systems will conflict with one another. So you can't be a Buddhist and a skeptic. Um, you can't be a Stoic and an Aristotelian. These systems conflict with. You can't be a utilitarian and a deontologist. They have deep commitments about the way the world is that conflict with one another, even though they direct your life and they tell you how to live. They have these deep systemic commitments, whereas the word that keeps coming to mind is piecemeal. I don't know if that's the right word, but it's like the, as you said, the kind of the self-help carves off a specific topic and it doesn't require those commitments. So it's kind of easier to get down. And I think, as you said, the best part about the best parts of Stoicism is that, something like the dichotomy of control, that's something that is almost self-helpy, right? And that it's something that you can almost incorporate into any worldview. What other people have called kind of shallow Stoicism is maybe the self-help version of Stoicism, something that you can incorporate into any worldview. And then when you get into a deeper Stoic view, like the idea that virtue is the only good, these that is something that is not reconcilable with other ways of living, and so that's the kind of deeper system commitment. And so I wanted to talk about, so that's a descriptive account, but like, okay, what does self-help do better than ancient philosophy, and what does it do worse than ancient philosophy? Is there, should you be careful with self-help, or is it okay to really love these books and really really enjoy them? um, so I'm going to start off with what self-help does worse than ancient philosophy, in my opinion, obviously, in broad strokes here. First, I think that self-help does not always have a strong focus on practice. In that, when I say practice, I mean deep transformative practice. I think self-help risks giving people the false impression that they're learning something, um, and then the sense that they're improving when really they're just maybe gathering a set of concepts or gathering a set of ideas, but not actually putting in the work for transformation. And so I think about this quote from Epictetus all the time. I think about it in terms of Stoicism. This is not a criticism that just comes against self-help. I think self-help is just particularly vulnerable to it. But this is Epictetus. He's criticizing other Stoics. And he says, so this is Discourses 1.4. And he says, suppose I should say to a wrestler, show me your muscle. And he should answer to me, see my dumbbells. Your dumbbells are your own affair. I want to see the effect of them. Take the treatise on choice and see how thoroughly I have pursued it or perused it. I'm not asking about this, O slave, but how you act in choosing and refusing, how you manage your desires and aversions, your intentions and purposes, how you meet events, whether you're in harmony with nature's laws or opposed to them. If in harmony, give me evidence of that, and I will say you're progressing. If the contrary, you may go your own way and not only comment on your books, but write some like them for yourself. And what good will it do? So this idea, to break that down simple, it's this classic idea of Epictetus wants to see your muscles and you show him your weights. And when we're Stoics and we're interested in transformation, we want to see the things that we can do. We want to see the progress that we've had. We don't want to see or put on a pedestal the tools of that progress. And that's the example of the treatise on choice. That's a student saying, look, I've read some Chrysippus. I've really memorized it. And he's like, I don't care. Show me whether or not you have desires for the right or wrong kinds of things. And basically, I think that self-help, you run into that risk, that stereotype of somebody having a shelf full of self-improvement books, but not really having improved all that much. And I think that's because self-help can be almost trivial in a sense. And I don't mean trivial in terms of not being relevant, but just shallow, surface level. And it's that first step before the hard work, but it doesn't actually require the hard work or involve that commitment to the hard work. Not always. It's almost like a starting point, and so it runs that risk.
Well, it's always easy to consume and feel like one is doing work to improve oneself in some way when it comes to self-help. I think that's probably true. And there's also that risk when you're engaging with Stoic content or Stoic works as well. So I suppose that's one thought, but I think sort of the deeper or the challenge you're getting at by saying that there's not that strong focus on practice from self-help is highlighting that for ancient philosophers, philosophy involved what Pierre Hadot called a conversion. And he's talking about becoming a different person when you practice it,
Mm-hmm.
and not practice in the sense of, ordinary practical daily action, but that action that's grounded in uh, fundamental character change. And I think that's a significant challenge to self help in a way where if you're coming to it to solve particular problems, perhaps what's needed are questions around some more fundamental aspects of whatever you're facing, and that's what philosophy pushes you to question. It's not always easy. Sometimes practicing philosophy, it's like going to the hospital, as Epictetus says. It doesn't always feel good.
Yeah, I was thinking of that exact metaphor. I mean, I have one from a quote from Seneca here. His letters, letter 117, his letters on ethics. Consider too that the mind prefers to amuse itself rather than restore its health, making philosophy into entertainment when it's really a cure. Um, the same kind of metaphor. We don't want to take our medicine. We'd rather go to a movie and think about interesting ideas than do the tough part. I think that's it. We especially when you're selling a book, you're selling a product. There's a tendency to try to make it as palatable and pleasant as possible, um, which is not always what people need. I think of this metaphor we use in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu coaching, or not really a metaphor, just a description, which is that you need a coach to help you do the things you wouldn't do on your own, right? If you do it on your own, you wouldn't need a coach. So often the times the goal of the coach is to make you do things that make you quite uncomfortable. And so I guess there's two different levels there. I'm talking about this as kind of being uncomfortable and finding things difficult and being pushed, which self-help always doesn't always do. And then the point you were raising too was about, sometimes if you just float around on that shallow level, you're not actually going to see the results you want when the results need to start from a more deep transformation. That was another point you were making, which I think is a good one, which is sometimes missed. If you're talking about the nature of habits, for example, you're sometimes missing that deep transformative aspect.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's well put.
The other thing, there's also the fact that systems are reinforcing. So the Stoics talk about Stoic philosophy as a complex system that when you become a good person, everything kind of locks into place. There's no longer any sort of temptation or ignorance or issue that can kind of knock down what you've built. They use this metaphor of kind of solidification, right? So it's the virtuous person, the person who's just almost virtuous, they've got everything, but they're not considered a good person until that solidifies, until it locks into place, and your quality of character gains that rigidity. And what provides that rigidity in Stoicism is this mutual interconnectedness of all the arguments. Whether you agree with them or not, the Stoics thought they did. And what that means is that you can ask a Stoic any sort of why question, and there's an answer to that, right? Well, you should focus on the things you can control and the things you shouldn't control, and don't focus on the things you shouldn't control. Why? Well, because the things that you control are your character. They're the things that are up to you, and they're the things that matter. Why are those things that matter? Well, you have some sort of teleological argument. Everything kind of is reinforcing there. And so what you risk with shallow stoicism is not just, or anything learned shallowly, is not just that you don't know as much of it. It's not just if you just learn the dichotomy of control, you only have 1/10 the value of stoicism or the 1/50th the value of stoicism. It's that you can't actually make use of it properly without the deeper parts that reinforce it and hold it in place. When push comes to shove and a real crisis occurs, you're going to give up the dichotomy of control. And I think that real risk occurs with self-help as well, which is to say, if you're not learning it as part of a deeper system, it's fine and good when things are going well. But when push comes to shove, you're likely to give up what you've learned. You're likely to question it or not really understand why it's worth the commitment unless it fits into this kind of broader belief system and commitment base. All that's to say that just it's not going to connects that same idea of deep transformation. It's what you're lacking. That's part of the reason why it's lacking that deep transformation aspect.
Yeah. So I guess the thought is that often what you'll find in self help is a system of rules or heuristics, rules of thumb. And those can be useful until they're not, until they break. And then there's that question, how you decide between different rules of thumb. Maybe you've got some other resources to help you do that. But in the case of at least some self help, you're just falling down to your own personal ethics, might be something that many self help type books say, they'll just encourage you to live according to your values or something like that, which is important. But there's that always that question, what are your ethics grounded in? What's ultimately determining your decisions? And here we're talking about ethics in the broad sort of ancient sense about guiding who one should be, not merely how you treat other people, but really that art of good decision making. And Stoics, I can add some details to that. Some of these other life philosophies that we've mentioned can add some detail to that. But I think if one spends too much time in self help, you might have less of an ability to make good decisions when certain heuristics aren't working, or maybe not
Yeah.
realize that certain heuristics aren't working.
Yeah, that's a good point. I mean, it just gives you, I think that's right. It gives you a set of skills for a certain set of contexts and not a way to kind of improvise when those heuristics aren't working. Another thing is just I mean, it's a pretty common criticism. And I think a lot of these, now that I'm talking about it more, just come down to that idea of deep transformation, which is to say, if you're set in the wrong direction, you don't have your life in the right track, and you get good at habits, for example, habit formation. That's important. But now, that's not necessarily going to correct the larger issues, and it might actually magnify or provide feedback into problems you have, right? If you have, an unhealthy relationship with work, and then you get really good at forming habits to make you work harder, you're more adding fuel to the fire than you're solving the problem. And so that problem, I think, needs to be kind of foundational. It obviously can come both directions. You can start with the habits that to do foundational transformation, but I think it has to come down to foundational transformation at some point. And Caleb, here you have some other things you wrote about what ancient philosophy does better than self help.
Yeah. So some other ways that I wrote down in which ancient philosophy is better is that often self help is not connected to a training program, and it doesn't have a sense of levels to it. And we've mentioned a few different works like Atomic Habits, I don't think has this problem, but I think some works, especially ones that might simplify other therapies or something of this sort, sometimes run the risk of not communicating that there are levels to practice, and evaluating, where you're at can be really useful. And if you go back to that sports analogy, martial arts analogy, you might teach a technique in some way if someone's at a beginner level, teach it another way if they're at an advanced level, and most importantly, have a training program that guides people along those levels. And at their best, that's something the ancient philosophies have, whereas many self help type books of the therapeutic nature, of the entrepreneurial nature, don't really have that, or they're promising, that black belt level, that pro level to people who
Mm.
are white belts, amateurs, too fast without giving the training program, the support that people need.
Yeah, this is a good point. It is advertised for beginners, often advertised for beginners, and because it's not like a sports that you can practice for years. It's not like a university curriculum where you come back and you have 101, 201, 301. It's trying to contain the entire topic. It gives the impression of reaching the end of the topic, but it has, by its nature, just had to do it in the way that is the most accessible to beginners, which is not the end of the topic typically.
Yeah, I think so. But sometimes it does promise that end.
Hmm.
too fast, I think. So that's one concern. I think another concern with some self-help is that it's just not good advice sometimes. So if you think about I think a lot of entrepreneurial type self-help is almost too meta. They'll teach you how to be rich, and the author is rich. They are wealthy, but they've become wealthy by teaching other people how to be wealthy. And it's sort of this meta train, which is, I think, somewhat strange. Is that do you expect the person with that kind of profile to give the best entrepreneurial advice? I'm not so sure. So that's one kind of example. We mentioned The Secret earlier. Many people pillory The Secret because they find it not useful, just a kind of woo. Um, Whereas some of these other ancient philosophies, especially as we updated them for the modern age, or sort of integrated some of the learnings from modern psychology and so on, have withstood the test of time.
Yeah, Nassim Taleb has this idea that um, the longer something has been around and is still read or engaged with, the more likely it is to be around in the future. Which is to say that any book that came out 5 years ago and is still read is less likely to be still read in 100 years or in 5 years than the Stoics. It's just that it's a way of saying that the things that we still engage with have stood the test of time, which is to say there was a lot of bad philosophy coming out in ancient Greece. There was a lot of silly schools and thinkers and bad writers. And we have Marcus Aurelius, Epictetus, and Seneca and these people because they were the very best. And their thinking has proven useful over generations. So it's almost this, I talked about the start of self-help. It could be earlier than this, but at least how to win friends and influence people in the 1930s. And it's like you're almost more likely to find something of value from older books like that are still talked about, whereas than going to your local store and seeing the modern bookshelf where some of these might just be bad, right? Some of these might just be forgotten, where you're not going to run that risk. If you read a 2,000-year-old philosopher that somebody still talks about, you might not agree, you might not even enjoy it, but there's going to be something important in that and something worth learning about.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're Lindy, as Nassim Taleb says. They've got he talks about a restaurant called Lindy or something like this that he's confident will continue to exist because it's already existed for decades, as opposed to some other fancy looking restaurant that opened up across the street. And I think how to win friends and influence people is a good example of that, because that's a solid book that's lasted for a long time.
Cool. Let's switch gears. That felt negative. I felt bad for
Yeah, yeah.
like
Now
it
now
felt
let's
very
talk about
critical. Let's talk about some good
uh,
stuff.
yeah, let's talk about what we
um,
can take from self
yes.
help.
Yeah. Not only what can you take from it, what I actually think it does better than philosophy. The first thing I think self help does better than philosophy is just that it's accessible. Accessible. There's this really kind of stereotypical self help writing that I've noticed now, which is like anecdote, idea, maybe closing anecdote. And it gets on my nerves sometimes when I open up a book and I go, well, here's a story. And every single time the chapter starts off with a story. But the reason it's not like that is because it works, it's accessible, it helps give an emotional connection to abstract ideas. And it helps the really kind of like case studies, right? It helps break down these abstract ideas. And that writing style works. It's successful because it hooks people. And if you hook people, um, you're going to help people, you're going to reach people. I remember myself when I first was deciding if I wanted to switch into philosophy. I said I wouldn't necessarily call it a self-help book, but I read a popular philosophy book, and it was really really helpful for me to think, well, this is something that I really enjoy and think is really interesting. It'd be worth digging into that deeper level, be worth digging into that transformative level. But you've got to kind of be cautious about your time, and you've got to be cautious about where you spend your energy. And so accessibility is a good thing to hook people and prove that these ideas are worth their time. And I think it just does it just just almost always does that better than philosophy. I think maybe Stoicism is the exception, and I think Stoicism is quite famous because it is a good hook, because there is an appeal, an immediate appeal to sitting down and reading Marcus Aurelius, but you don't get that sitting down and reading Aristotle. You don't get that in the same way reading most of Plato, I would say. And so that accessibility is just going to help people because it's going to be read. And it's better, even if self-help is worse than philosophy, in my opinion, for self-transformation, better you read something that's an 8 out of 10 than not read something that's a 10 out of 10. And that's great. I think that that genre has really nailed how to get people thinking about self-improvement.
Yeah, thinking about some of these examples, whether it's James Clear or Malcolm Gladwell, about what clear writing looks like, how to express complex ideas well in a clear manner. I think at its best, it does that well, perhaps better than philosophy. And then going back to that training program point, I think sometimes people stumble across a book like the Meditations because that's something that Marcus Aurelius wrote it to himself as an advanced practitioner of Stoicism. So even though there are lines that many people that anyone can take away, and many people, regardless of their experience with Stoicism, can be influenced in a positive direction by that book. Others encounter Meditations, find it confusing. They don't get a good sense of what it is.
Yeah, it's a good way of, and as we're talking about this, I'm thinking about somebody like Ryan Holiday and his writing, and trying to think if these ideas can apply. And I almost think that Ryan Holiday is like the self-help of Stoicism. And maybe that's a bit, I just like, so he's accessible, does a great job of communicating these ideas simply with clear writing, gets it mostly right, at least like most of it quite accurate, but then lacks a kind of systematic approach, or lacks sometimes references to other parts of the theory. And that's why you get kind of criticism from a philosophy perspective. But in terms of a self-help perspective, it's doing quite good self-help, even if it's not necessarily doing philosophy. Uh, he sometimes gets criticism from more philosophically inclined people because it's not philosophy, even though it's talking about philosophy. It's just quite good self-help grounded in philosophy, but not philosophy itself. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I would think of his work as the closest thing we have to Stoic self-help. That makes sense to me. I think it also um, something he's really good at is telling stories in a way that's grounded in history, at least popular versions of history as moral stories, that sort of following the tradition of Plutarch or other ancient biographers. And you can see that sometimes even when he'll talk to on his podcast, he'll talk to academics, and it's clear that he has a better sense of Marcus's own life than someone at a prestigious Ivy school, which I think is cool and nothing to sneeze at. And it's because of his interest in telling stories well that he also, I think, understands the lives of many of these Stoic figures. And we talked about in our conversation, I think on the obstacle is the way, or maybe a later book.
We did the Lives of Stoics.
Oh, the Lives of Stoics. Yeah. I think we talked a little bit about how his career started more as you have that obstacle is the way type book, which it takes a single Stoic idea and not a particularly, it's a powerful one, but not one that I would say is philosophically foundational, and applies it in a self help way. And that can sort of serve as a gateway to deeper Stoic ideas, which we now see him writing on the Stoic virtues. So I think you can see that development in his career as well, which is cool.
Yeah, and well, I mean, so you mentioned it as a gateway to these other ideas, and that's the other thing I wanted to say that I think self-help does better than philosophy, is it acts as a gateway. I think of maybe this buffet metaphor, which is to say, if you go to a buffet, it's if you want a steak, or I don't know, you want good seafood, a buffet is not the place to get it. But if you don't know what you want, then maybe one of those Vegas worldwide buffets is the place. Oh wow, it turns out I actually kind of like seafood. Oh wow, this was an interesting dish. Maybe I'll go to a nicer Chinese restaurant next time and dig into it. So it lets you dip your toes in lots of different ways of thinking. Because I think a downside to philosophy is it in being doctrinal, incentivizes getting into camps. And even myself, I'm in the Stoic camp, and maybe I break out of that by looking at other ancient philosophers or other philosophies as a way of life. But it takes a long time to understand a system. And so you really kind of double down in one of these systems. Academic philosophy is the same way because you have to specialize in something. So you become, well, I study Nietzsche or I study Kierkegaard. And so it incentivizes doubling down. But there's not really any kind of sense of camps or teams or sides in the self-help world. Everybody is almost kind of agnostic, and they're saying, well, I'm going to take a little bit from this, I'm going to take a little bit from that. And it's almost this ideal in a way, where you're open to the best ideas of all the different systems. And I guess the ideal is you would make your own kind of system. And I think there's something pretty beautiful about that. There's nothing weird about taking some ideas from Malcolm Gladwell, and then taking some ideas from James Clear and putting them together. This would be encouraged and normalized in the self-help space, where I know there's, if you were to take some ideas from Stoicism and combine them with some ideas from Buddhism, people might do this, but it would be counterintuitive to a philosophical approach for the same reason we were talking about before, which is that Stoicism is supposed to link in. It's supposed to be a mutually agreeable system or mutually reinforcing system. So if you start adding something from Buddhism, you're breaking apart the system, whereas self-help doesn't really have that issue. And that's kind of nice, especially nice if we're being humble, which is to say maybe we don't really know which system is the right one to commit to. Maybe we don't really know which side is the right side to pick. So I'm going to stay at that buffet. I'm going to stay at that with that sampler plate of all these different great ideas. And that's not necessarily a bad place to be.
Yeah, I think we're all trying to balance our uncertainty with genuine conviction in life philosophy. I think once you get interested in something like Stoicism, Buddhism, maybe even existentialism, then you recognize that there are some advantages, as we were talking about in the beginning section, to these foundational worldviews. But we're all human. We don't know. There is always that specter of skepticism, of uncertainty, both I think at the foundational level. Is this part of Stoicism really correct? And also, I think the practical one, is this the right way to apply Stoicism, or is Stoicism helping me see what's most important in this situation? So I think we're trying to balance those things. And if, self help risks a kind of shallowness, lack of conviction, a failure to fundamentally transform, on the other side, you have philosophy that can risk a kind of dogmatism,
Mm-hmm.
rigidity, or maybe even just a distraction on these issues of identity. You find yourself in a defensive posture when something comes up, instead of recognizing, what's important in a given situation.
Yeah, I think that's bang on. And that could be that could just be a good thing. Or at least we could use a bit more. Maybe the ideal is somebody who has a philosophical system they follow. But by the ideal, I'm about to describe myself. So you have a philosophical system you follow while also being open to fun, accessible exposure to new ideas through engaging in self help books or just kind of keeping an open mind to other books in that area. I mean that connects to the last thing I was going to say is just something that self help does well. It's just fun. It's fun to read. It's motivational. It connects at an emotional level through the stories you were just mentioning. Ryan Holiday does a good job of this, and that's good for. I do not think that's good for sustained long term transformation, but it's a good way to start a journey. It's a good way to start a change, and the same way you said you teach a move one way to a beginner, and you teach a move one way to an advanced person. I think one of the main differences there with a beginner, someone who teaches beginner jiu-jitsu classes, you try to make things fun, and you worry a bit less if you worry a bit less if things are right than if people will keep coming back and people will keep find the idea interesting. There's a quote by an ancient thinker. I think I can't remember exactly who it was, but it said that education is not the filling of a bucket, but the lighting of a fire. And I think about that line a lot. And I think self help does a good job of lighting some fires. And um, you know, if you, one thing that came out in this conversation, Caleb, that I think was interesting is this difference between heuristic and a system. If you think of philosophy as a system and self help as like a set of kind of shallow heuristics, if you come into self help knowing it's a set of shallow heuristics, or can be at least, risks being that, and you meet it for where it is, and it inspires you to say, well, it's actually I want to get to know the system behind that, then that's just a total net positive. Or if you take it as just a set of heuristics and you understand that's all it is, then I
Mm-hmm.
also think that's a positive. I think the only risk now is a false identification, which you mentioned earlier, which is to say something promises a system, something promises mastery, and what it's given you is a set of heuristics. Some book says, you're going to learn all you need to know about Stoicism from reading this one book, and what it's giving you is a set of anecdotes, right? And that's not the same thing. But either inspiring you to go deeper or meeting it at what it is, it has a lot of value.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. You can also treat it as reminding yourself of what's important. I think even if it's not a topic you're familiar about, self help can play that role of, you're listening to a given book, reading a given book about, improving how you interact with other people and improving your self control, whatever it is. That at least is one way to keep that topic front of mind. Of course, there are always different questions about strategy, timing, context that matters. Um, but I think that's related to this point, that it has this motivational force that also the ancient Stoics do. I think in a way you're almost looking for what's that message that, given your level, provides the right level of detail and motivational force.
Hmm. Cool. Anything else to add about things you like about the self help genre?
Yeah, well, I think sometimes self help can be too vague, too abstract. I think the 12 Rules for Life sometimes has this. At least some people come away with lessons that are too abstract and don't apply to their ordinary life. But I think at its best, it can be specific in a way that is useful for specific areas you want to work on, whether that's developing habits by James Clear, or if you think about your working style, books like Deep Work by Cal Newport, or learning books by Scott Young on ultra learning or how to get better at anything. If those are areas you're focused on, those kinds of books, high quality books about becoming more productive, becoming better at your relationships, have a kind of specificity that abstract philosophy does not always have, won't always give you. And sometimes you just need that instruction manual uh, instead of more free form guidance. I think any life has a mix of those, right? That mix of explicit instruction as opposed to more abstract prompts. And one advantage of self help is many works of self help, I should say, not all, do give you that more specific guidance.
I feel like sometimes Stoicism does that, but it's too dated now. It's all like, don't cut your beard, or like, what roles to have in a marriage from 2,000-year-old Roman Masonius Rufus or something. I think Stoicism sometimes gives that specificity, but it's not really helpful for us now. But yeah, absolutely. If you I almost need like a term for this. There's that kind of system of beliefs, that foundational belief system. And if that foundational belief system says, hey, I want to learn how to get better at like deep work, I want to learn how to get better at habit formation, then then you can kind of plug and place these books as ways of kickstarting or pushing that development. And that's absolutely right. And there's nothing that's a huge benefit in a way that, some reading the Stoics isn't going to teach you in reading any philosopher isn't going to teach you.
I agree with that 100%. So we should wrap up with some self help that we've found useful in our own lives, then, I think.
So in terms of self help that we both like, I was thinking about the books that have impacted me, and I think the reason they've impacted me is the stuff that we've talked about over this conversation. Is I think they've looking back on these books. So I would say Anti-Fragile by Nassim Taleb and Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl are probably the two self-help books that have had the largest impact on me. And when I think about those books, I think about them as containing not deep transformations of who I am as a person, but one, two, three, or more really, really true, helpful heuristics well explained. So the idea of anti-fragility, we did an episode on this, the goal of becoming stronger in the face of adversity. That is a helpful heuristic, well explained, that I feel like I'm able to apply. In terms of Man's Search for Meaning, famous book about the importance of meaning over pleasure and the value that the things that you're able to put up with and essentially do if you have a sense of meaning, the amount of pain and suffering you can go through if you have that. I think that's another helpful facet of the world that I call to mind. And so those books are really influential to me, I think, because again, it's like tools in the tool belt, right? And Stoicism to me is so much deeper than that and so much more than that. But it's so nice to have these tools, if they're really good tools, either from other systems or other ways of thinking about the world. And so those are two books that were been really influential to me.
Yeah, it's interesting that the two of those are, if you think about philosophy and narrow self help on a continuum, I think they're closer to the middle in a way, where they both, I think both Nassim Taleb and Viktor Frankl have philosophies guiding their thought.
And what about you?
Some books I want to mention are, we've already mentioned this a handful of times, but I think How to Win Friends and Influence People is a good example of self-help that's lasted the test of time, and also specific advice for how to be better at relationships. Nearly all of the heuristics in that book are good ones. There's another book called The Inner Game by Timothy Galway, which is about sports, but I think can apply to learning and performance broadly, that I found really useful and is something I think about quite often. On the entrepreneurial side, I want to mention the book 0 to 1 by Peter Thiel and Blake Masters. I think there are also like other, I think other good self-help books. There's a case to be made that there's a deeper philosophy driving that book that is worth thinking through, worth wrestling with. And then a oddball recommendation perhaps is the book The Screw Tape Letters by C.S. Lewis, which is modeled as letters between two demons attempting to knock a like former Christian off the path of being a good person. Um, so of course it's a Christian book, it's written by C.S. Lewis after all, but I think it personalizes certain forms of vice in a way that can be useful. And C.S. Lewis was a very adept psychologist, I think, good at recognizing types of people and ways people go astray. So that can be a useful book to, I think through, even if you're not a Christian, of course, and provide maybe different ideas, models, tactics, and also challenges to some problems you might be facing.
Yeah, I've heard good things about the Screw Tape Letters. I haven't read it, but maybe that'll be next on my list. I'll add it to the to read pile.
Nice, awesome. Well, if
Yeah,
you have
great.
any other books you think in the self-help category that we haven't mentioned, that'd be good ones. If you have other recommendations for us, do let us know at our email.
Yeah, we can do a book review too. We like
Yeah,
those.
totally.
Awesome. Thanks, Gil.
All right, thanks, Michael. Thanks for listening to Stoa Conversations. Please give us a rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify and share it with a friend. If you want to dive deeper still, search Stoa in the App Store or Play Store for a complete app with routines, meditations, and lessons designed to help people become more stoic. And I'd also like to thank Michael Levy for graciously letting us use his music. You can find more of his work at ancientlyre.com. And finally, please get in touch with us. Send a message to stoa@stoameditation.com if you ever have any feedback, questions, or recommendations. Until next time.